June the 13th, 1944, 4:15 a.m. The V-1 flying bomb's pulse jet engine cut out over East London. In the 3 seconds of terrible silence that followed, anyone awake in the Grove Road area knew what was coming. The impact against the railway bridge sent a concussive wave through 6 city blocks. Metal shrieked, brick pulverized. The explosion's orange flash lit the pre-dawn darkness like a miniature sun, and when the dust settled, 6 people were dead, 30 injured, and 200 had no home to return to. This was the first. Over the next 80 days, 9,521 more would follow. But what the British public never knew, what couldn't be known until decades after the war, was that salvation from Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign would come from an American invention German physicists had declared scientifically impossible. A device no bigger than a man's hand that seemed to violate the known principles of physics. The Germans would capture them, examine them, test them, and still never understand how they worked. By the time they came close to figuring it out, the trajectory of the war had already been decided. 1 week after D-Day, as Allied forces struggled to expand the Normandy beachhead, Hitler unleashed his first Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. The V-1 wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, it was essentially a primitive cruise missile, a steel tube packed with 1,070 pounds of untold explosive, powered by a pulse jet engine that produced a distinctive buzzing sound British civilians learned to dread. The sound meant you were safe. It was the silence after the engine cut out that brought terror. From launch sites in occupied France and the Low Countries, V-1s were fired toward London at all hours. They flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. The guidance system was crude, a mechanical autopilot that used a magnetic compass for direction and a small propeller-driven counter to measure distance. When the counter reached a preset number, the elevator controls locked into a dive position and the engine cut out. The missile plummeted. Where it hit was essentially random within a several-mile radius. This randomness was part of the terror. The first week of attacks revealed the scale of the threat. Between June 13th and June 20th, 1944, German forces launched 873 V-1s toward London. Of those, 244 reached the London civil defence region. The impacts killed 195 people and seriously injured 768 more. Thousands were made homeless. The psychological impact was devastating in a way that conventional bombing raids weren't. With bomber formations, air raid sirens provided warning. People could take shelter. The attacks had patterns. The V-1 offered none of that predictability. They came individually at random intervals, day and night. Londoners who had endured the Blitz with grim determination found themselves facing a new kind of dread. You couldn't hear the V-1 coming until it was nearly overhead. You couldn't predict where it would hit. You could only listen for the engine to cut out and pray it wasn't directly above you. British defences were immediately thrown at the problem. The solution seemed straightforward. Shoot them down. The execution was anything but. Fighter aircraft struggled with the V-1's speed and size. The fastest fighters in RAF inventory, Hawker Tempests, Spitfire Mark 14s and Griffon engine variants, could catch them, but only in level flight and only if positioned perfectly. Pilots discovered that shooting at a V-1 was extraordinarily dangerous. If they got too close and their bullets ignited the warhead, the explosion could destroy the attacking fighter. If they fired from too far away, their bullets missed the small, fast-moving target. The effective attack range was narrow and required exceptional skill. Even the RAF's best pilots found V-1 hunting frustratingly difficult. Anti-aircraft guns faced even worse odds. The AA batteries ringing London were equipped with timed fuze, shells that exploded after a preset duration of flight. Gunners had to estimate the V-1's altitude, speed, and trajectory, set the fuse timing, and fire. If every estimate was perfect and the shell exploded within the lethal radius at exactly the right moment, the V-1 might be destroyed. In practice, this almost never happened. Intelligence assessments from late June 1944 showed that AA guns using conventional timed fuses were achieving destruction rates of approximately 9%. It took an average of over 2,000 shells to bring down a single V-1. The mathematics were unsustainable. Germany could manufacture and launch V-1s faster than Britain could shoot them down. Behind closed doors, Winston Churchill confronted a possibility he had never seriously considered even during the darkest days of the Blitz: the potential evacuation of London. His private secretary, John Colville, recorded Churchill's assessment on June 27, 1944. The Prime Minister was examining casualty projections and V-1 launch rate estimates. If the attacks continued at the current intensity, and if German production ramped up as intelligence suggested it might, London could suffer 10,000 to 15,000 casualties per month. The city's infrastructure would degrade, morale would crack, the government might have to disperse. Churchill didn't share these fears publicly, but within the War Cabinet, contingency plans were quietly drafted. The terrible irony was that this was happening as Allied forces fought in France. Victory in Europe seemed inevitable, but Hitler's vengeance weapons threatened to make London uninhabitable before that victory arrived. Then there were the pilots who decided that if their guns couldn't reliably stop the V-1s, their aircraft could. Beginning in late June, RAF pilots began deliberately using their wing tips to tip V-1s off course. The technique required flying alongside the missile at 400 miles per hour, matching its course exactly, then carefully sliding the fighter's wing under the V-1's wing and applying a quick upward jolt. The disrupted airflow would flip the V-1's gyroscope, sending it into an uncontrolled tumble that usually ended in an explosion in the English countryside rather than in London. It was insanely dangerous. The turbulence from the V-1's pulse jet could flip the fighter. The timing had to be perfect. One miscalculation meant collision at 400 miles per hour. Multiple pilots did this successfully. Some did it repeatedly. Flight Lieutenant Joseph Berry tipped over 4 V-1s in a single day. Squadron leader Arthur Berry, no relation, accounted for over 60 V-1s through a combination of shooting and tipping. These men were willing to risk their lives in split-second maneuvers because conventional defenses were failing and London was burning. By early July, British military leadership recognized they needed a technological solution. Bravery and skill weren't enough. The V-1 campaign was a war of attrition, and Britain was losing. AA guns couldn't hit what they couldn't precisely time. Fighters couldn't intercept enough missiles fast enough. The launch rate was increasing. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany had thousands of V-1s stockpiled and was producing more every day. At the current destruction rate of roughly 40% from all defensive measures combined, 60% of launched V-1s were reaching London. The casualty numbers were climbing. What British commanders didn't yet know was that the solution was already crossing the Atlantic. In nondescript wooden crates marked radio tubes and electrical components, sealed under armed guard, transported on ships that zigzagged across U-boat-infested waters, the most classified anti-aircraft munition in the Allied arsenal was en route to England. The security protocols surrounding these shipments exceeded those of some Manhattan Project materials. If a transport ship carrying them was attacked and in danger of sinking, standing orders required their immediate destruction. If an aircraft transporting them was shot down over enemy territory, the wreckage had to be destroyed from the air. No sample could fall into German hands intact. The reason for this obsessive secrecy was simple. The devices inside those crates did something German physicists had publicly declared impossible. They were called VT fuses, officially variable time fuses, though that name was deliberately misleading. They were proximity fuses, radio-activated detonators that would explode an anti-aircraft shell at the optimal distance from its target without requiring any estimate of altitude, speed, or trajectory. They worked automatically, they worked reliably, and according to every German assessment of vacuum tube technology and the physical stresses of artillery firing, they absolutely should not work at all. The delicate electronics inside should shatter under the 20,000 times normal gravity acceleration when fired from a gun barrel. The miniaturized components should fail in atmospheric temperature extremes. The radio circuit should be impossible to manufacture at scale or at a cost that made mass production viable. German scientists were right about one thing. With German technology and German manufacturing capabilities of 1944, the VT fuse was impossible. But American industrial engineering had reached a level that German intelligence had drastically underestimated. In the factories of the United States, an army of workers, many of them women, were hand-assembling vacuum tubes smaller than a thumbnail, with precision measured in thousandths of an inch. They were producing them not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands per month, and every single one had to work perfectly the first time because there would be no second chance. In a cramped conference room at Anti-Aircraft Command headquarters outside London, a demonstration was arranged for July 1944. American technical advisors, British artillery officers, and Ministry of Supply officials gathered around a table. On it sat a single 90mm anti-aircraft shell, unremarkable except for the fuse screwed into its nose. The American technical liaison, a colonel whose name remains classified even in recently declassified documents, explained what they were looking at. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. When fired, it would begin broadcasting a radio signal. That signal would bounce off any metal object in proximity, such as an aircraft or a V-1 flying bomb. When the reflected signal reached a critical strength indicating the target was within lethal blast radius, the fuse would trigger detonation. No timer, no estimation, no human calculation required. The shell would know when it was close enough and detonate itself. The British officers were skeptical. One asked the obvious question: what prevented the shell from detonating when it detected the metal of the gun barrel during firing? The American colonel smiled. That, he explained, was one of several clever bits in the design. The circuit didn't activate until after the shell left the barrel. The question of how they made vacuum tubes survive barrel acceleration without shattering was met with a polite deflection. Manufacturing tolerances beyond standard production capability. That was all the British needed to know. The question of cost prompted genuine surprise from the British contingent when they learned each fuse cost less than $20 to produce. The question everyone wanted answered was simple: does it work? The answer would come soon enough. AA batteries in southern England were being quietly re-equipped with VT-fused ammunition under strict security protocols. Gun crews were given minimal information. Use these shells only over land where any duds can be recovered. Report any failures to detonate immediately. Do not discuss these munitions with anyone outside your unit. The crews weren't told why. They didn't need to know that they were about to field test a weapon that would fundamentally change anti-aircraft warfare. They were about to witness what German physicists had declared scientifically impossible, and the Germans, watching their V-1 destruction rates from across the Channel, were about to realize that something had changed, something they didn't understand, something that would gut the effectiveness of Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign in a single day. August 28, 1944 was 3 weeks away. On that day, 94 V-1s would be launched toward London. The numbers from that day would tell a story that would shock German High Command and change the strategic calculus of the V-1 campaign forever. But in early July, as the first VT-fused shells were loaded into British AA guns, none of that was certain yet. The only certainty was that London couldn't sustain the current casualty rate much longer, and conventional defenses had reached their limit. What happened next would either validate the most ambitious anti-aircraft weapons program in history or reveal an expensive failure. The gun crews didn't know which, neither did the engineers. Neither did Churchill. The V-1s kept coming, and in the pre-dawn darkness of southern England, artillery crews loaded shells with mysterious fuses into their guns and waited for the next pulse jet buzz to cut through the sky. To understand why the VT fuse was revolutionary, you need to understand just how primitive anti-aircraft gunnery was in 1940. When German bombers darkened the skies over London during the Battle of Britain, British AA guns fired hundreds of thousands of shells. Post-battle analysis conducted by the Ministry of Supply revealed a devastating truth. It took an average of 2,500 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single German aircraft. Not 2,500 shells fired at one plane, that would bankrupt any military budget, but 2,500 shells expended per aircraft destroyed across all engagements. The mathematics were brutal. If a shell cost $5 to manufacture and you needed 2,500 of them to down one bomber, you were spending $12,500 in ammunition alone per aircraft destroyed. The Luftwaffe was losing planes, but Britain was losing the economic war of attrition. And the fundamental problem was the fuse. Every anti-aircraft shell fired in 1940 used a mechanical time fuse. Before firing, a gunner or gun crew member had to estimate the target's altitude, calculate how long the shell would take to reach that altitude, and manually set a timer on the fuse. The timer was a mechanical clockwork mechanism that began counting down the moment the shell was fired. When the timer reached 0, the fuse detonated the shell. If the estimates were perfect, the shell exploded near the aircraft and shrapnel destroyed it. In practice, estimates were almost never perfect. Aircraft changed altitude. Wind affected shell trajectory. Altitude estimation from the ground was inherently imprecise. Gun crews became extraordinarily skilled at these calculations, but skill only improved accuracy marginally. The laws of physics and the limitations of human perception imposed hard limits. Even the best crews missed far more often than they hit. The problem consumed military researchers throughout 1940 and early 1941. Britain needed a solution. America, watching the Battle of Britain with increasing alarm and anticipating eventual entry into the war, needed one too. In August 1940, as the National Defense Research Committee in the United States established Section T, a division focused specifically on developing a proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells. The goal was audacious: create a fuse that could detect its own proximity to a target and detonate automatically at the optimal distance. No human estimation, no mechanical timing. The shell itself would know when to explode. The challenge was translating that concept into a device that could survive being fired from a gun and actually work. The fundamental problem was physics. When an artillery shell is fired, it experiences acceleration forces of approximately 20,000 times normal gravity, 20,000 g. For context, a modern fighter pilot experiences perhaps 9g during extreme maneuvers and requires special equipment to avoid losing consciousness. Artillery shells experience forces over 2,000 times greater. Any electronic component inside the shell had to survive those forces without breaking, cracking, or deforming, and it had to work immediately after experiencing them. Then there were the environmental requirements. Anti-aircraft shells might be fired in Arctic conditions at 60 degree T or in desert heat exceeding 120 degree F. The fuse had to function reliably across that 180 degree temperature range. It had to work in rain, snow, humidity, and dust. It had to be simple enough to manufacture by the millions and cheap enough that using dozens per engagement wouldn't bankrupt the military. And it absolutely could not malfunction in a way that caused premature detonation. A fuse that exploded shells inside the gun barrel would kill friendly crews. The solution that Section T developed was conceptually elegant and practically nightmarish to manufacture. The fuse would contain a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, essentially a tiny radar system. When the shell was fired and reached a safe distance from the gun, a battery would activate the radio circuit. The transmitter would begin broadcasting a continuous radio signal. That signal would radiate outward in all directions. When it encountered a metal object, such as an aircraft fuselage or a V-1 steel frame, some of the signal would reflect back. The receiver would detect that reflected signal. As the shell approached the target, the reflected signal would strengthen. When the signal strength reached a predetermined threshold, indicating the shell was within lethal blast radius, the fuse would trigger detonation. The entire process would happen in fractions of a second, completely automatically. Making it work required solving problems that pushed 1940s technology to its absolute limits. The radio transmitter and receiver had to be miniaturized to fit inside a shell fuse approximately 5 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. For scale, that's smaller than a can of soup. Inside that space, engineers had to fit a radio transmitter, a radio receiver, a power source, amplification circuits, a detonation trigger, and safety mechanisms to prevent premature firing. The core components were vacuum tubes, glass tubes containing metal filaments, and electrodes in a vacuum, the same technology used in radios and early computers. Vacuum tubes in 1940 were fragile. They were the size of a human thumb. They shattered easily. They were not designed to survive 20,000 G acceleration forces. Every conventional engineering assessment said they would break when fired from a gun. The breakthrough came from manufacturing precision, not fundamental redesign. Engineers at the Raytheon Manufacturing Company, Western Electric, and other contractors developed techniques to manufacture vacuum tubes at tolerances far beyond standard commercial production. The tubes used in the VT fuse were approximately the size of a pinky finger's first joint, about 1/3 the size of standard vacuum tubes. Every internal component was reinforced. The glass envelope was thicker. The metal elements inside were designed with flexibility to absorb shock rather than rigidity that would shatter. The vacuum seal was tested to pressures far exceeding normal operation. Each tube was tested individually before assembly. Failure rate targets were set at less than 1%. This was unprecedented in vacuum tube manufacturing. Commercial tubes accepted failure rates of 5 to 10%. The VT fuse couldn't. If a tube failed during flight, the fuse failed. If the fuse failed, the shell was wasted. Reliability wasn't optional. The assembly process was equally extraordinary. Manufacturing a single VT fuse required approximately 200 individual operations. Many of them had to be done by hand under magnification. Women workers, thousands of them in factories across the United States, assembled components smaller than grains of rice using tweezers and specialized tools. They soldered connections that had to be perfect because there was no way to repair them after assembly. They calibrated circuits to precise frequencies that would distinguish reflected signals from background radio noise. They sealed the units in waterproof, shock-proof casings. Then every completed fuse went through testing that simulated firing forces and environmental extremes. Units that failed were disassembled to determine why, and the manufacturing process was adjusted. By mid-1943, production lines were manufacturing fuses at a rate of over 40,000 per day. Each one cost approximately $18 to produce, expensive for a fuse, but cheap compared to firing 2,500 shells with conventional fuses. The security measures surrounding the VT fuse were obsessive and unprecedented. The fuse was given a higher security classification than many aspects of the Manhattan Project. The reasons were strategic. If Germany obtained a working VT fuse and successfully reverse-engineered it, they could potentially deploy their own proximity fuses on anti-aircraft shells defending German cities from Allied bomber raids, or, worse, on surface-to-air missiles that would devastate Allied air superiority. The risk was unacceptable. Protocols established in 1942 dictated that VT fuses could only be used in situations where duds could be recovered. Initially, this meant they were restricted to naval use over water, where a dud would sink into the ocean rather than fall into enemy hands on land. The U.S. Navy deployed VT fuses in the Pacific Theater starting in early 1943, where they proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft. Kamikaze attack success rates plummeted when ships equipped with VT-fused anti-aircraft shells created virtually impenetrable defensive barriers. For use over land, the protocols were even stricter. Every VT-fused shell fired over land had to be accounted for. If a shell failed to detonate, recovery teams had to secure the crash site immediately. If an aircraft transporting VT fuses was shot down over enemy territory, Bomber Command had standing orders to destroy the crash site from the air before German forces could reach it. Aircrew carrying VT fuses were briefed on their importance and ordered to destroy any intact fuses before bailing out, if possible. This level of security was maintained not because the concept of a proximity fuse was secret. German engineers had theorized about proximity fuses before the war, but because the Americans had actually made it work at scale, and how they made it work was the crown jewel of Allied weapons technology. German physicists knew proximity fuses were theoretically possible. In 1937, a German researcher named Hans Carl von Willissen had filed a patent for a proximity fuse design based on photoelectric cells. The German military investigated radio-based proximity fuse in the late 1930s and concluded they were not feasible for production. The technical assessment was sound based on German manufacturing capabilities. German vacuum tube production could not achieve the miniaturization, durability, and reliability that a functional proximity fuse required. German engineers calculated that vacuum tubes subjected to artillery firing forces would shatter or have their internal elements deformed to uselessness. Their calculations were correct for German tubes manufactured to German tolerances using German production techniques. What German intelligence failed to grasp until too late was the extent to which American manufacturing had advanced. The precision machinery, quality control processes, and production techniques in American factories had reached a level that German industry couldn't match, particularly after years of Allied bombing had degraded German industrial capacity. This was the device that arrived in Britain in July 1944. British AA Command received the first shipments with a mixture of hope and skepticism. American weapons technology had proven itself. The Norden bomb sight, the M1 Garand rifle, the proximity fuse's effectiveness in the Pacific had been reported, but the V-1 presented unique challenges. It was smaller than an aircraft, flew faster than most bombers, and came in at altitudes where AA guns had struggled to achieve any meaningful hit rate. The question wasn't whether the VT fuse worked in theory or even in controlled tests. The question was whether it would work against the V-1 in actual combat conditions with production line fuses fired by regular gun crews under operational stress. The initial deployment was cautious. Selected AA batteries in southern England were re-equipped with VT-fused ammunition, while others continued using conventional time fuses. This wasn't just for testing, it was also for security. If every battery suddenly switched to a new ammunition type and the destruction rate skyrocketed, German intelligence would know that something fundamental had changed and might intensify efforts to recover intact fuse from doomed shells. By mixing VT-fused and conventional ammunition across different batteries, the hope was that improved effectiveness would be attributed to better tactics, improved gun-laying radar, or crew training rather than a revolutionary fuse technology. It was a calculated gamble. Every day that VT fuses weren't deployed at full scale, more V-1s reached London. But every premature revelation of the VT fuse's existence risked German countermeasures or successful reverse engineering if they captured one. By late August 1944, enough data had been collected to make a decision. Limited deployments showed that VT-fused shells were achieving destruction rates of approximately 75% to 80% against V-1s, a nearly tenfold improvement over conventional fuses. The batteries using them reported that gun crews barely needed to adjust their aim. The shells were doing the work. Point the gun at the incoming V-1 fire, and the shell would detonate itself at the optimal distance. Crews who had spent months firing dozens of shells at single targets and watching most miss were suddenly seeing V-1s disintegrate after just a few rounds. The psychological impact on the gun crews was profound. For the first time since the V-1 campaign began, they felt like they were winning. On August 28, 1944, British AA Command made the decision to deploy VT-fused ammunition across all batteries within range of V-1 approach corridors. The gun crews were issued new ammunition with unusual instructions. Use these shells only against aerial targets over land. If any shell fails to detonate, immediately secure the area and contact headquarters. Do not discuss these munitions with anyone outside your unit. The crews weren't told why the instructions were so specific. They weren't told about the miniature radios inside each fuse. They weren't told about the manufacturing miracle that made them possible or the security classification that made them more secret than atomic bomb components. They were told to load them, aim, and fire. What happened when they did would validate everything Section T had worked toward for 4 years. It would justify the millions of dollars spent on development and the tens of millions spent on production. And it would demonstrate to German High Command that they were facing an American technological achievement their best scientists had declared impossible. August 28, 1944 began like most days that summer in southern England. Gun crews at AA batteries stretching from Dover to Portsmouth performed morning checks on their equipment, cleaned barrels, and prepared ammunition. The sky was overcast. Visibility was moderate. Intelligence reports indicated that German launch activity at V-1 sites across the Channel remained steady. The crews expected another day of near-constant alerts, the distinctive pulse jet buzz cutting through the air, and the frustrating experience of firing dozens of shells at small, fast-moving targets. What they didn't expect was to witness the most dramatic single-day shift in anti-aircraft effectiveness in the history of warfare. The first V-1 of the day was detected at 6:47 a.m. by coastal radar stations. AA batteries were alerted. Gun crews tracked the incoming missile. At 6:51 a.m., a battery near Ashford, Kent, acquired the target visually and opened fire using the new VT-fused ammunition. The first shell detonated approximately 70 feet from the V-1. The explosion's shrapnel shredded the missile's thin metal skin, severed control cables, and punctured the fuel tank. The V-1 tumbled out of the sky and impacted in an empty field 3 miles short of its intended target. Time from visual acquisition to destruction. 18 seconds. Shells expended. 3. The gun crew stared at each other in stunned silence. They had just accomplished with 3 shells what previously required dozens of attempts and often ended in failure. They didn't have time to process what had happened. The second V-1 was already inbound. By noon, gun crews across southern England were reporting destruction rates that seemed impossible. Batteries that had struggled to hit 1 in 10 V-1s were now destroying 3 out of 4. The shells were performing exactly as promised. Gun crews didn't need pinpoint accuracy. They needed to get the shell into the general vicinity of the target, and the fuse did the rest. Fire control officers monitoring the engagements noticed that even shells that appeared to miss by significant margins were detonating near the V-1s. The radio proximity mechanism was working. Every time a shell passed within lethal range of a V-1's metal frame, the reflected radio signal triggered detonation. The V-1s were flying into a defensive zone where near misses had become as effective as direct hits. German launch crews across the Channel had no idea what was happening. From their perspective, the launch operations were proceeding normally. V-1s were fueled, armed, and fired from their ramps at regular intervals throughout the day. Visual observers reported normal launches with missiles disappearing over the horizon toward England. There was no indication from the launch sites that anything had changed, but in the intelligence centers at German High Command, analysts watching the operational reports from England noticed something strange. British defensive success rates had spiked dramatically. On August 27th, the previous day, approximately 52% of launched V-1s had been destroyed before reaching London. This was consistent with recent averages. On August 28th, that number climbed throughout the day. By evening, the statistics were undeniable. Of 94 V-1s launched that day, only 17 had reached the London Civil Defence region. The other 77 had been destroyed en route. The overall destruction rate was 82%. The numbers were broken down further. Fighter aircraft had accounted for some kills. Barrage balloons had claimed a few, but the overwhelming majority, 74 out of 94, had been destroyed by anti-aircraft guns. The AA gun effectiveness rate had jumped from approximately 17% to 79% in a single day. German intelligence officers reviewing these figures initially suspected errors in the data. When the numbers were verified, they suspected the British had concentrated additional AA batteries along the V-1 approach corridors. Reconnaissance flights showed no significant increase in gun positions. The placement of batteries hadn't changed. The number of guns hadn't changed significantly, but something had absolutely changed, and German commanders needed to know what. The immediate tactical impact was devastating to the V-1 campaign's effectiveness. The entire strategic premise of the V-1 relied on overwhelming British defences through volume. Germany could manufacture V-1s relatively cheaply and quickly. Each missile cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce, expensive but far cheaper than a bomber aircraft. The strategy was to launch them faster than Britain could shoot them down, gradually accumulating damage to London's infrastructure and morale. When 40–50% of launches reached their targets, the mathematics worked. When only 18% reached their targets, the strategy collapsed. Germany was expending resources to manufacture and launch missiles that were being systematically destroyed before impact. The cost-benefit equation had inverted. Within a week, German intelligence prioritized recovering intact examples of whatever the British were using. Agents in Britain were tasked with investigating crash sites. Luftwaffe reconnaissance was ordered to photograph AA battery positions to look for new equipment. And most importantly, recovery teams were instructed to examine any unexploded British AA shells found in France or the Low Countries. On September 4, 1944, a German recovery team secured 3 unexploded British 3.7-inch AA shells that had been fired at V-1s over occupied Belgium. The shells were carefully transported to a Wehrmacht ordnance facility for examination. What the German engineers found inside confused them profoundly. The fuse screwed into the nose of each shell contained components that made no sense for a mechanical time fuse. There was a small battery, there were vacuum tubes, multiple tubes, miniaturized far beyond standard German production capability. There were radio components. The engineers recognized they were looking at a radio transmitter and receiver, but the miniaturization was shocking. The entire assembly was smaller than a man's fist. More confusing was the durability. These shells had been fired from guns, experiencing catastrophic acceleration forces, and the vacuum tubes hadn't shattered. German engineers knew their own vacuum tubes would never survive that stress. They examined the tubes under magnification and found construction techniques and tolerances that German factories weren't achieving. The glass was thicker and more uniform. The internal elements were reinforced in ways that suggested manufacturing precision beyond standard practice. One engineer's report, declassified in the 1970s, included the assessment: the components suggest American manufacture. The precision indicates industrial capability significantly beyond our current estimates. German physicists were brought in to analyze the fuse's operation. They reverse-engineered the circuit and understood the concept quickly. It was a proximity fuse using radio reflection. The principle was sound and actually rather elegant, but the execution revealed a manufacturing capability that Germany couldn't match. Replicating the fuse would require vacuum tube production at tolerances German factories couldn't achieve with available machinery and materials. It would require quality control processes that German industry, stressed by years of war and Allied bombing, couldn't implement, and most damning, it would require time. Even if Germany invested significant resources into developing equivalent manufacturing capability, the timeline for production would stretch into 1945 or beyond. By then, the war's trajectory would already be decided. A report submitted to German High Command in October 1944 concluded that while the VT fuse was technically replicable in theory, practical replication was not feasible given Germany's current industrial capacity. The report recommended focusing defensive efforts on hardening V-1 guidance systems and developing countermeasures rather than attempting to copy American proximity fuse technology. The recommendation acknowledged implicitly what German leadership was beginning to understand. American industrial and technological capability had advanced beyond German estimates, and the gap was widening rather than closing. For the British gun crews who had witnessed the August 28th massacre of V-1s, the implications were more immediate and personal. For months, they had fired at targets knowing most of their shells would miss, knowing that every V-1 that got through might kill civilians. The psychological toll of ineffective defense had been grinding and demoralizing. The VT fuse changed that completely. Gun crews who had felt helpless now felt effective. Morale soared. Crews requested additional ammunition and longer shifts. They wanted to keep firing because for the first time their fire was decisive. The V-1 attacks continued through March 1945, but the terror campaign Hitler had envisioned never materialized. London didn't evacuate. Morale didn't crack. The vengeance weapons were systematically destroyed by a device most of the defenders didn't understand and weren't allowed to discuss. The VT fuse's impact extended far beyond the V-1 campaign. In the Pacific Theater, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells had been decimating Japanese air attacks since 1940. Kamikaze attacks that relied on overwhelming ship defenses through numbers found that numbers weren't enough when every AA shell created a kill zone rather than requiring a direct hit. Naval analysis after the war estimated that VT fuses reduced ship losses to kamikaze attacks by approximately 50% to 60%. Thousands of American sailors survived battles they statistically should not have because shells exploded at the optimal distance from attacking aircraft rather than missing by yards. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, VT fuses were authorized for use in ground combat for the first time. Artillery shells fused with VT proximity detonators were fired at German infantry formations. The shells detonated above ground at optimal anti-personnel height without requiring observers to estimate fuse timing. The effectiveness was devastating. German forces advancing through the Ardennes faced artillery barrages where every shell functioned as an optimized airburst. Casualty rates from American artillery fire spiked dramatically. By war's end, American factories had produced approximately 22 million VT fuses. They had been integrated into anti-aircraft shells, artillery shells, and even rocket warheads. Post-war analysis by military historians estimated that VT fuses increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by 500% to 800% depending on conditions and targets. The economic impact was equally significant. By reducing the number of shells required to destroy aerial targets, VT fuses saved more in ammunition costs than they cost to develop and manufacture. But the strategic impact was what mattered. Allied air superiority, already significant by 1944, became unchallengeable. German and Japanese aircraft couldn't survive in airspace defended by VT-fused AA fire. As the defensive umbrella over Allied forces, ships and cities became virtually impenetrable, German scientists examining VT fuses after the war admitted what they had known during the conflict but couldn't publicly acknowledge. It was among the most remarkable technical achievements of the war. The combination of miniaturization, durability, reliability, and mass production represented an industrial capability that Germany had underestimated. In the post-war interrogations, German physicist Dr. Hans Kummerow stated that the VT fuse represented not a single innovation, but a complete production system operating at a level of precision we had not believed economically feasible. So it wasn't just that Americans had made it work, it was that they had made it work at a cost that allowed deployment by the millions. The women who assembled VT fuses in American factories never saw their work destroy V-1s over London. Most didn't know exactly what they were building or how it would be used. Security protocols meant they assembled components without understanding the complete system. They worked under magnification in quiet rooms, soldering connections smaller than grains of rice, calibrating circuits to precise specifications, testing each unit to failure tolerances measured in percentages of a percent. They did this in shifts around the clock for years. 22 million fuses, each one a small miracle of precision manufacturing, each one potentially saving lives by making defensive fire effective rather than symbolic. The VT fuse didn't win the war by itself, no single technology ever does, but it represented something more significant than tactical advantage. It demonstrated that innovation under pressure could solve problems that seemed intractable. It proved that manufacturing precision could overcome theoretical limitations. And it showed that the dedication of thousands of people working on components they barely understood could combine into a system that changed the strategic calculus of warfare. That device, no bigger than a man's hand, the one German physicists had declared scientifically impossible, had stopped Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign, saved countless Allied lives in the Pacific, and demonstrated a level of industrial capability that the Axis powers never matched. Sometimes the most profound victories don't come from overwhelming force. Sometimes they come from making physics work in a 5-inch fuse traveling at 3,000 feet per second, broadcasting a radio signal, waiting for the reflection that means a target is close enough, and then, in a fraction of a second, changing everything.